So I've realized recently that we have a bit of a problem on our hands, and that's the big shortage. More specifically, the shortage of handhelds that feel both unique and also practical at the same time. Now, this is a very serious problem that affects every single person on this planet, but there's a potential savior that's coming from Anbernic, and it's attempting to do both and bring a unique spin to a remarkably retro design. This is the RG Rotate. It's the latest handheld console in Anbernic's rotation, but this one has a rotating display that reveals a full set of classic controls under the screen. Coming in at a towering 8 centimeters tall and wide, this can fit right in your pocket and easily flip out to game everywhere. It has a 3.5-inch pixel-dense display and comes in 2 versions, black plastic and a full metal silver. Under the hood, both models are running Android 12, powered by a Unisoc T618 chipset. It's surprisingly versatile and practical for something that seems like a gimmick, but it's far from perfect. From software bugs to hardware missteps and some really bad decisions, this handheld might be the most divisive device that I've ever reviewed on this channel. So in this video, we're gonna dive deep into the RG Rotate, play some games on it, and talk about all of its features and flaws, so we can decide if this really is the best pocket handheld for you. Is the RG Rotate a winner handheld spinner? Or should we rotate it into the nearest trash can? Well, let's find out. So here is the box that the RG Rotate comes in. There's not too much going on with this box. It is very chrome, as all things are in the future. On the side here, we have our 2 colors, Polar Black, which has a plastic base, and Aurora Silver, which has a full metal build. It's very premium feeling. That's the one that we're gonna be taking a look at. Let's see what's going on inside the box. Now let's put this to the side and we'll take a look at what else is going on in the box. We have a small handful of goodies, including a USB A to C cable, a screen protector that seems to be pretty decent quality, and an instruction manual. So here is the RG Rotate. Now, my first impression of this thing is it is actually relatively small. I thought that this was gonna be a lot bigger than it actually is, but it kind of sits in a Goldilocks zone. It's small enough to be portable and pocketable, but it's big enough to be substantial when you're actually using it. However, when you turn it to its side, it is pretty damn thick. I'm telling you, this is a chunky boy. When you put it in your pocket, people might catch your Rotate print, especially if it's gonna be in there with something like a phone and maybe a pair of earbuds as well. It can really add up into a devastatingly tall pocket pyramid. The weight of this device is also pretty normal for a handheld. It's actually the exact same weight as a Game Boy Color, and less than a gram heavier than a DSi. Now, the plastic model is about 37 grams lighter, or 20% lighter compared to the silver metal version. I'd still consider this a travel-friendly handheld that's very portable for the amount of gaming and comfort that it provides. It's just gonna be a little bit thick in there, but that's kind of the only downside to its portability. No, not again. All right, now let's take a look at how the size of the Rotate compares to some other devices that you're probably more familiar with. First up is the original Mii Flip. The size of this one is very similar to the Anbernic RG SP, but I don't have that one, so we'll be taking a look at this Mii Flip. It's only a couple millimeters taller than the Rotate, almost identical in width, maybe a hair wider. And here's what they look like in full extendo mode. Here's how it compares to the much smaller Mii Mini Flip. The Mini Flip is much shorter in pocket mode, but only slightly shorter when flipped out. And the Mini Flip is slightly thicker than the RG Rotate. And here's what they look like in Stackovision. Here's another excellent metal handheld, the TrimUI Brick Hammer. The Brick Hammer is much taller when the Rotate's closed, but when it's spun out, the Rotate is a fair bit taller. The controls also rest higher on the Brick Hammer compared to the Rotate, so the Brick Hammer could be more comfortable because of this. However, the shoulders are also lower on the Brick Hammer compared to the Rotate. The Rotate is also a little bit wider. Here's how it compares to a GKD Pixel 2, another metal handheld. Noticing a theme here? The Pixel 2 is only a millimeter taller than the Rotate, but the RG Rotate towers over the Pixel 2 in full rotation. The Pixel 2 is slightly thicker than the Rotate when the Rotate is extended out, but the Rotate is much thicker in pocket mode. And I keep hearing it in the comments, so I finally did it. I bought a real handheld, a Nintendo new 3DS. The height is almost identical when they're closed, but the 3DS is a fair bit taller when it's unfolded. The RG Rotate is about half the length of the new 3DS, and the Rotate is significantly thicker than the 3DS. Here's how it stacks up to a Game Boy Color cartridge. And here's how they look in StackOvision Ultra. Here's an Xbox Series controller for scale, and an iPhone 13 Pro. It's just a little thicker than the iPhone. The Rotate is about twice the height of an AirPod Pro's 2 case, only a hair thicker. And here's what they look like in StackOvision Infinite. And I know I'm gonna hear it in the comments, so just buy a Switch 2, bro. All right, now let's go through the super nerdy specs for nerds as fast as we physically can. On the front of the device, we have a 3.5-inch IPS display with a resolution of 720 by 720. That's a perfect square. It's pretty weird for most systems, but it looks pretty good. That's housed in an aluminum alloy body with a dome switch style D-pad and face buttons in the Nintendo layout, A on the right, X on the top. We have a select and start button and a home and back button. There's a micro SD card slot on the left side, a USB-C port on the top, no headphone jack, and a power and home launcher button on the right side. Under the hood, we have a Unisoc T618 chipset with a Mali G52 GPU, a modest 3 gigabytes of RAM and 32 gigs of onboard storage in an eMCP configuration, a very shitty 2000 milliamp hour battery, Wi-Fi 5, Bluetooth 5.0, and it's all running Android 12. Whew, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the comfort of the RG Rotate. Generally, I'd consider this a pretty comfortable handheld. It's got a square shape to it, but no real sharp edges along the side here. They're rounded a little bit on front, and the backside is actually much more rounded than you might expect. The controls are also pretty well placed and comfortable given the size of this device. I actually thought it was going to be much less comfortable when I saw Anbernic's original photos. Turns out to be a pretty natural feeling handheld, even for someone with medium to small, large hands like me. Here, let's clock it. Give it the old tape check. About 9 inches, pinky to thumb. So I'd say that the Rotate is actually gonna be much more comfortable compared to other travel handhelds that are in this similar size, like the TrimUI Brick Hammer and GKD Pixel 2. Compared to those, this is a more balanced and more natural control layout. Now, it's still a travel-sized handheld, so comfort is a sacrifice, but given the criteria, I think they did a pretty good job here. Unfortunately, a weirdly shaped handheld has weirdly shaped quirks, and these show themselves when you're playing in reclined positions or when you're playing in bed. This has a tendency to tip forward and slide out of your grip when you're holding it beyond that 90-degree angle. Everything just wants to completely topple right onto my face when I start to doze off. There's also a small notch on the side of this display that keeps it from over-rotating when you spin it closed. It kind of catches there like a latch. But when you keep it open, you can sometimes feel it on your finger. And this latch is kind of sharp too. It's not something that you can easily ignore. But I found that after a couple days, my finger naturally adapted to it without even thinking about it. And now I just play with a slight distance between my index finger and that latch. It's a problem that has been less annoying the longer that I use the Rotate. Now, the main feature of this RG Rotate is obviously the rotating hinge. And I can tell you straight up, it is so satisfying. I'm not over exaggerating how satisfying and snappy this thing is. Like, holy shit. You can do it one-handed all day. But I'm gonna put my money where my mouth is, and we're gonna put 10 seconds on the timer and see how many we can get. Let's go. Ref, how many times was that? I blacked out. That's 10 on the board, clock it. Not too bad for a washed up pro. Now this rotating screen gimmick is extremely satisfying, kind of like hitting that subscribe button. But it's also practical because it protects the controls down here by putting a screen in front of it. Now, I know that might sound counterintuitive because it is. Technically speaking, a clamshell device would have been a more protective solution to cover both the screen and the buttons. And then when you're ready to game, you can just flip the device out and reveal both the screen and the controls. Now, meanwhile, with the RG Rotate, you're only protecting the controls by using the screen. So I originally thought this was a pretty stupid idea and very flawed decision until I started using it. And then I realized that I actually prefer to have the screen on the outside instead of this perfectly protective clamshell. You can not only play games with it closed, touchscreen games like Nubby's Number Factory, Professor Layton games too, but what I also noticed is that it feels like a very seamless transition from it being locked to entering a game. There's no clamshell revealing of the screen and then tucking it away after. Instead, it's a much more sensory and visceral feeling to spin open your screen. Something else that the rotating display does is it has a more balanced center of gravity. And this is something you can actually feel when you're gaming too. The weight is much more evenly distributed compared to something like a clamshell handheld, where all of the weight is in that base of the handheld, while the top screen is more of an accessory. By the way, on the back of the screen, there's 4 small screws, and on my unit, they became loose and scratched the device over time. They actually left a pretty huge gash and a smaller screw mark on the bottom corners. Now I noticed that the rotation felt a little crunchy, but I didn't realize that it was carving up my handheld. Now the only way to reach the ones that were scratching my device was to completely disassemble it, tighten the screws, and then reassemble the device. And what kind of gave it away was that the top 2 screws were already loose. So you could start there, but if you feel like your rotation was a little crunchy and you notice scratch marks on the bottom front corners, then it's probably a good idea to roll up those sleeves, get under there, tighten up the back screws, and then reassemble it and get back to gaming. All right, now let's take a look at the controls. On the top of the device, we have 4 inline shoulder buttons with L1, R1 on the outsides and L2, R2 on the insides. These are clicky buttons, not analog triggers. The outer bumpers are pretty well shaped with a nice curve on the edge, giving more places for your finger to press on them from. They have a short travel and tactile press that's very satisfying. Now these shoulder buttons are very loud and clicky. There's no hiding the fact that you are a gamer when you're gaming with this thing. Other people will be well aware. They could probably hear you from across the room. Unfortunately, the inner buttons with L2 and R2 are much harder to reach, especially with the flat buttons. It's pretty hard to tell where they are and how to press them without also pressing the outer bumpers. But little old Anbernic is always 2 steps ahead, it seems, because they included extra shoulder buttons that are a little bit higher. So instead of this flat shelf up here, you could have the option of sort of a step up on the L2 and R2 buttons. Much easier to identify, especially when you got a screen in the way. But with all that said, the shoulder buttons are one of the weakest aspects of the device. Anbernic including the second pair of shoulder buttons is more about optics and catering to their die-hard fan base instead of actually improving the experience of the RG Rotate. They don't include a screwdriver that fits this handheld either. And that's where I think most people will just stick with the original shoulders here, even if they're not ideal. Now let's talk about these face buttons. On the front of the device here, we have 4 face buttons in the Nintendo layout, with A on the right and X on the top. The face buttons have a very short travel and a soft tactile click to them too. They have a softer, more muted sound compared to the shoulder buttons that kind of sound like you're throwing pebbles at a window every time you click it. But I'd still say that these face buttons are louder than you might be expecting. While the sound is just a bit more prominent than other handhelds in this size, the feeling of them is very tactile and satisfying. The buttons and D-pad use dome switches, so instead of something like membrane buttons that have a longer travel and a more squishy retro feeling, these ones are more tactile and modern feeling, so I often prefer dome switch buttons. Now let's move over to the D-pad. This D-pad is awful. You might think that it's just a normal D-pad at first because it feels like one. In fact, it feels pretty good. But when you try to play any precision games, especially analog stick titles, the flaws become crystal clear. This D-pad commits the cardinal sin and heavily favors diagonals, to the point that you can just hold the D-pad up or down and it'll move your character to the sides. I find myself fighting against the D-pad in almost every precision and analog stick-based game. We're fighting against two problems at once. We don't have analog input, so it's either 0 or 100% in any direction. But on top of that, it's 100% to the corners when you don't even want it to. So let's take a look at this D-pad and see if we can trigger some accidental diagonals without even pressing on the side buttons here. Even with my fingertip on the edge of the D-pad, it's still triggering corners. And for reference, here's a pretty great D-pad from the Retroid Pocket Classic. This is how any D-pad should work. It shouldn't trigger any direction unless you press that direction. And diagonals should only occur when you're pressing both directions at the same time. Now, there are DIY solutions that may be able to improve the accidental diagonals. However, I think Anbernic should just work on using a better D-pad because they've done it on other handhelds. I don't know how they managed to drop the ball so hard on here, but it is pretty foul. In between the buttons and D-pad, we have our usual suspects of start and select. And up top, we have a home back combo button for the Android operating system. And in between all of those is actually a super sneaky microphone that I didn't even know was there until I saw a review on it. And then I realized that there's actually a mic there. Then we tested it on stream. Yo. I did a test with my boy. Right. And I can confirm that this is a certified Nintendogs machine.
Subscribe.
And you can use that to bark at your virtual dogs. So let's take a look at what else is on the device here. On the left side, we have a micro SD card slot and volume up and down rocker. On the right side, we have a power and sleep button and a dedicated front end launcher button. This is different than the Android home back button on the front. This actually launches any front end that you want, not just Anbernic's front end. So you can reassign it to launch something like Daigisho, ESDE, Beacon, or another front end that is actually my favorite. We'll talk about that in a little bit. On the bottom, we have a Anbernic logo with a sneaky Wi-Fi Bluetooth antenna hidden underneath. That's why this is a different texture. Over on the bottom corner, we have a sneaky little lanyard slot. And then on top, we have a USB-C port for data, charging, and USB-C headphones too. We don't have a headphone jack on here. And next to that is an indicator light for charging and battery. And finally, on the back of the device, we have what might be the worst feature of this handheld, a single backfiring speaker. Anbernic decided in their infinite wisdom that the best place for audio is away from your ears. And not only that, you got a screen covering it too. Now the placement of the speaker is pretty much as bad as it gets. They couldn't have chosen a worse placement if they tried. But we'll do an audio test a little bit later to see how the volume and quality of this speaker hold up. All right, now let's do a very scientifically rigorous power on time test to see how long it takes to boot this little thing up. just about 23 seconds. That is pretty damn solid for an Android device like this. It's not necessarily the fastest boot on time of any Android device, but it's about on par with a lot of other devices. If it was above 30 seconds, I'd consider that a little sluggish, but luckily this thing is pretty quick to go to sleep and pretty quick to wake up too. So I often just put it to sleep when I'm not using it and charge it fairly regularly because it has a pretty small battery under the hood. Now the screen on the RG Rotate is very unique. It's a 3.5-inch 1x1 completely square IPS display, which is also very pixel dense and has a resolution of 720 by 720 pixels with great saturation and contrast too. This isn't gonna be as rich and deeply vibrant as an OLED panel like something on the Retroid Pocket Classic or maybe your cell phone, but it's still very solid. Now having this completely square aspect ratio will be quite strange compared to many other handhelds. It's great for emulating a small handful of systems, but everything else has pretty significant bezels. We have perfect Peak 08, excellent Game Boy, NES, and Super Nintendo, and everything else is generally decent, except for PSP, unless you're really determined to stretch that thing. Another side effect of this high-resolution square display is it makes a lot of native Android apps look weird, small, or weirdly small. When it comes to the less mainstream apps, you'll often get a couple visual oddities at best, or unreadably tiny text with invisible prompts at worst. Now, some people have mentioned that there's pretty bad screen ghosting on this panel. From my casual use over the past few weeks, I haven't personally noticed any ghosting, but I also didn't notice anything wrong with using a worm light on my Game Boy 25 years ago, so I guess my barometer is a bit skewed on this one. And I've heard other people mention that there's input latency with this display. So let's take a look at if there's any noticeable input latency. Now, this is not a very sophisticated test, but if we were to count the frames from the moment I press the button to the moment an action happens on screen, there's between a 2 to 3 frame difference in a 60 frame per second clip. This gives us a 33 to 50 millisecond delay from the input to the action. Now we've taken a look at the hardware of this hard metal device here, but let's talk about the software experience of the Rotate. Out of the box, I've been generally impressed with how seamless the experience is, especially by Anbernic standards. There are some occasional rotating screen bugs and floating multitask bar that sticks around the bar a little too long. Even with these occasional bugs, it's been very consistent and pretty easy to use. But one thing we can actually do to make the Rotate feel more like your traditional handheld gaming console is by using front-end launchers. A front-end is an app that we can essentially use to organize and launch our games from, similar to a Nintendo Switch or PlayStation home screen. When you first power on the device, you'll be greeted with your traditional Android home screen with a handful of apps and emulators. But when you press and hold the side button here, then you'll be launched into Anbernic's custom front end, the RG launcher. Now, most people will find this launcher to be pretty simple and straightforward. When you press select, you can pull up a sidebar with recents, favorites, search, settings, and tools. But I find there are plenty of other front ends that are both visually better and functionally better. So let's take a look at some of those. Most of these front-end launchers are designed for your typical widescreen handhelds, so finding a front end that's compatible with the Rotate can be a bit tricky for two main reasons: the very limited RAM and the square screen. Having only 2 gigs of RAM means that a lot of modern front ends like Cocoon, Console Launcher, and Isu feel quite sluggish. Usually you'll want twice the RAM at minimum for those front ends. And then there's the high resolution square display, which causes a lot of front ends to shrink down because of the space and resolution. What is this? A front end for ants? Now I've tested out 8 different front end launchers with different styles and features. Most of them were pretty good, but tended to load a bit slowly. The 2 most sluggish front ends on the Rotate are also two of the most popular front ends right now. Isu and Cocoon is what I would say, but Cocoon recently got a huge 3.0 update where they just overhauled everything and made specific features for the RG Rotate. They improved the performance, they added more shit, and it works really great now. It's really smooth, and it's kind of become my front end of choice as of late. So you can see how things just are always changing with the Rotate. Isu is actually relatively usable and loads up pretty quickly with essentials at first, but they can be a bit sluggish on some of the other aspects. On the other hand, there's two front ends in particular that I want to talk about because they feel really good on the Rotate. The first one is Beacon Launcher. Now, Beacon is a paid app. It's about $3 and you can find it in the Play Store. I really like its simple and intuitive design. It also scales pretty well on this unique square display. But my favorite feature is just how fast Beacon launches. It's very snappy, almost instantaneous compared to other front ends. But Beacon isn't perfect. You need to manually resync each platform when you add new stuff, and the themes are a bit limited. However, there's one free front end that you might be a bit more interested in, and that is Retroid. Retroid is basically a free Beacon alternative with a somewhat clumsy name. It has many of the same features as Beacon and other notable front ends too, like easy box art scraping, collections, simple appearance customization, and even global hotkeys for brightness and volume. It has a slightly slower load time than Beacon, but it's still quicker than all of the other front ends I tested. So I'll be using Retroid as my main front end moving forward. Unless something like, a Cocoon 3.0 update releases, because in that case, I might switch to Cocoon 3.0, which I did. Or even more recently, GammaOS Nano. It's an entirely custom operating system that's based on Android, but it doesn't feel like Android because it's designed for a dedicated handheld experience. It has performance improvements, global shaders like a CRT TV effect, optimized emulators. Oh, I could go on and on and on. It's so freaking cool. But I guess these are just the latest things that are in my handheld rotation. You know what I'm saying? All right, now enough beating around the bush. Let's talk about the performance of the Rotate. Performance on the RG Rotate is actually very impressive. I mean, it's not gonna change the world. It's not a revolutionary handheld despite its revolving screen. But what it does do is it brings us a lot of that mid-tier performance that we've come to expect from medium and larger handhelds, and it brings it into this smaller form factor, which is pretty uncommon for handhelds of this size. The RG Rotate is kind of in a Goldilocks zone of all of those. It's in the center of the Triforce of price, performance, and unique design. And it kind of combines all of them with a little bit of each. It doesn't quite nail any particular one of those, but it finds a nice balance of those different aspects. Now, bringing it back to performance, I've been very impressed with what we're getting out of this handheld. Android games like Gambonanza, Nubby's Number Factory, Cave Story are a blast. These native games often scale a bit smaller than I'd like, but as long as everything is usable, then they should be a great time. Just make sure to keep a magnifying glass on hand for those tiny text moments. Meanwhile, Pico 8 has been absolutely amazing on the Rotate, specifically because of this 3.5-inch 1:1 aspect ratio display. It is the perfect ratio for Pico 8. Now, if you haven't heard of Pico 8 before, I don't blame you. It's actually a fantasy console, so it's not necessarily a real retro console, but it was actually designed to feel like retro games would, but with modern sensibilities. So people can use the Pico 8 engine to make games, and then you can find them and play them through the Explore app. It costs about $15 for the license, but once you get it, then all of the games are free and you can browse and download and play them directly on your device. If you do pick up an RG Rotate, then I'd highly recommend checking it out. It feels like a match made in heaven with this device. Surprisingly enough, I've actually been playing a ton of 3DS and DS games on the Rotate. It's very unique to have a portable and relatively powerful Android device that can run a good chunk of 3DS. We don't actually see this too often. Now, a lot of games aren't going to run full speed. The heavy hitters like Mario Kart 7 and Super Mario 3D Land, those kinds of games don't run great. But lighter weight stuff like Animal Crossing New Leaf and RPGs are actually very enjoyable on here. This square aspect ratio screen also scales surprisingly well to these systems, especially with a hybrid layout like this. This handheld also has a touchscreen display, so it works pretty seamlessly with the DS and 3DS library. Unfortunately, the RG Rotate isn't powerful enough to run Melon DS for Nintendo DS emulation, which kind of sucks because it means that we don't get retro achievements or this feature. I'd recommend sticking to Drastic, which this device is plenty powerful enough to run. Drastic is an older Nintendo DS emulator optimized for low-end devices, but the Drastic build that Anbernic includes is ancient, dusty, archaic. It's also pretty buggy. The A and B buttons are swapped in the quick menu, but they're not swapped in the regular menu. And then on top of that, if you try to launch any game from a front-end app, it just puts you into the Drastic application. It doesn't actually launch the game itself. So I uninstalled it and replaced it with a newer fork that has some extra features, shaders, and bug fixes. The only thing that we have to do to set it up is to go into Configure Options, External Controller, and just map the controls. And when that's done, go back and go into General, and at the bottom, click System Directory, Scope Storage Folder, and then we're gonna point it to the Drastic folder. This will carry over all of our existing saves and configs and everything else that we originally had. Now, when it comes to your classic home systems like PlayStation 1, Dreamcast, and even most Nintendo 64 games, this device can handle those quite capably. The biggest drawback is that we don't have any analog sticks down here, so you're going to be pretty limited in terms of Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. But virtually all of the PlayStation 1 titles outside of Ape Escape and maybe a couple others will play and look pretty excellent on the Rotate. Now, most of these 3D home systems play in 4:3 aspect ratio, which is going to be a bit smaller than the square aspect ratio of this display, which gives us just below a 3.1-inch diagonal display, around an inch less than the TrimUI Brick and Brick Hammer, which have a 3.2-inch 4:3 display. Moving up a generation to GameCube and PlayStation 2, this is where things get much more rough. You can expect the very lightweight games to actually run pretty well on here. Now, anything above that, like Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, Zelda Wind Waker, that's where we're gonna have to start messing with the settings to even get a playable frame rate, and even that's gonna be pretty hit and miss. Now, it's hard to judge the entire playability of RPG games like Paper Mario and Wind Waker because they're such long titles, so some sections might run perfectly, but once you get off of that first island, then things just might blow into smithereens frame rate wise. But one thing that is consistent across all these games is that we're gonna have to make a pretty big concession, and that's by playing the PAL versions of these games, which cap out at 50 frames per second instead of 60, and that is considered full speed. Unfortunately, using PAL ROMs doesn't guarantee that any of these titles will actually run full speed. When it comes to the PlayStation 2 library, pretty much none of these games will run even remotely well, so I'd recommend sticking to the GameCube versions of those games. And unfortunately, if it's a PlayStation 2 exclusive like God of War, then you might have to play a PSP version of those games instead. If you're looking to play longer games like RPGs of that generation, then I'd highly recommend making sure that the game is entirely playable on this chipset by using something like EmuReady, because there's a chance that the first part of the game is playable, that it becomes completely unplayable in the second half of the game. So be mindful of that and definitely temper your expectations. And in case you're wondering, yes, this can in fact play one Switch game. I managed to get a short hike running on it at a pretty consistent 30 FPS. Not necessarily full speed, but it's running pretty consistently, definitely playable. Now let's talk about battery and heat. The battery life of the RG Rotate is not very good. It drains quickly enough that you'll probably notice it dropping while you're using it. Or if you're playing a game that hides the top bar here, then you might be shocked when the game starts to chug and then you look and it's at 1% battery, which happens to me quite frequently. I've caught myself checking the battery percentage in the quarter pretty often. This is actually one of the few devices that I have pretty bad battery anxiety about it. So to accommodate for my crippling battery anxiety, I just kind of leave this thing plugged in a lot. And once the battery light turns green, then I unplug it and hopefully get a couple hours of gaming on it. The Rotate can also be very inefficient in sleep mode. If you put it to sleep while in a high performance scenario like 3DS emulation with Azahar, you could lose up to 5% of battery life per hour while the device is fully asleep. So if you keep it asleep for 10 hours and go to play some games, you'll only have 50% battery life left. Meanwhile, putting the Rotate to sleep in a very low performance scenario like on your simple front end launcher like Retroid here, this only drains the battery at under 1% per hour. My test showed that after almost 9 hours, we only lost 6% battery life, which is significantly more efficient than leaving it asleep during gameplay. And my final impromptu test was taking it on a 2-day trip where I left it in sleep mode on the home screen. And I didn't actually use it for 2 days. It only drained 13% battery. So the sleep drain is around 7% per day on the default Android home screen with no other apps running in the background. So I'd recommend at a bare minimum to quit out of your games before putting the device to sleep for a long period of time. Especially if you're playing high performance games, then you would definitely want to save and quit and then put the device to sleep. However, the battery pains don't stop there. Keeping this thing in my pocket, it would turn on randomly and seem to also unlock itself. The power button is actually bumped out and not recessed. So if it slides over something rough, then it does that. If it hits a phone or something, then it just turns itself on. And I don't know if you guys are like me, but my pockets often feel like the fourth dimension where space, time, and matter all converge into complete chaos. Now, I was actually browsing AliExpress in a 2 a.m. half asleep fever dream, and I found some low profile button replacements for about $4. So we're gonna see if those can solve this problem, but that awaits to be seen. Now, one thing that helped a lot with these phantom unlocks on the Rotate was actually setting the Rotate setting to hibernation so that it would fully go to sleep when I closed it. If you have it set to its default setting of lock screen, then you put it in your pocket, and then if you slide it in, it just unlocks itself. But after setting it to hibernation mode, once you close it, it'll immediately go to sleep. One more thing to help with this is go to display and set your screen timeout to something relatively short, like 1 or 2 minutes. Now, when it comes to heat, the metal version of the Rotate tends to get pretty warm in general. Playing high performance games and demanding titles often get the device noticeably hot. I wouldn't consider it scorching, but it can be uncomfortable at times. Unfortunately, there's no active cooling on here, so we don't have any fans or any ways to keep the device cool outside of just passive dissipation. In extreme performance scenarios like playing a Switch game for 20 minutes, the device heats up to around 38 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and that'll creep up the longer you play because there's no fans that can cool it down. Now, this is far from the hottest handheld I've ever touched. That unfortunate award goes to the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, which maxed out at a scorching 152 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly burnt my hand off testing it. But the Rotate can get pretty warm. If you're sensitive to heat with other handhelds or phones, you might want to consider the metal version at the very least, since the plastic body can't dissipate heat as evenly. Now, both versions will get hot. I'd say that charging the device is the only time that it gets uncomfortably hot, essentially like a hot shower temperature. I'd often recommend just let the device charge. It'll charge pretty quickly because it's a small battery, or if you want a game while charging, then stick to the lightweight titles like Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, that kind of thing. For connectivity on this device, we have our usual gamut of Wi-Fi 5 and Bluetooth 5.0. Honestly, nothing too impressive. Bluetooth audio has significant lag even with low latency headphones. It's usually alright when listening to music or watching a video, but the audio lag is pretty awful when gaming, practically unplayable. So if you're looking to play practically any game that's not a visual novel, then I would recommend using that USB-C port for directly attaching headphones instead of relying on Bluetooth audio that has around a 1 second delay. Now the volume of this tiny little speaker is actually quite substantial compared to similar sized handhelds. Even though it's firing away from you, you can actually hear it quite loud, but it's not as crisp and clear as it would be if the speaker was on the front here facing you. It almost sounds muffled and like a TV playing from across the room compared to something where it's like your phone just playing audio towards you. But let's take a look at how the quality of this speaker compares to a similar sized device, the RG35XX SP, which also has a single mono speaker. Now that single backfiring speaker on the Rotate actually held its own against the RG35XX which is also, I should mention, half the price of the Rotate. What I was pretty shocked about is just how much louder the Rotate is compared to a front-firing speaker on the 35XX. Now the quality of the Rotate speaker is also pretty good, but unfortunately having a backfiring speaker means our experience will vary significantly based on what environment we're in. If you're in a relatively close space, like near a desk or a wall, then you'll have a pretty decent experience because the sound will just bounce right back into you. But if you're in an open environment or outside, then the sound is just getting projected into that open air. Just kind of an underwhelming experience compared to front-firing speakers where no matter where you are, that sound is still just going right at your ears. Another thing to consider is if you put the speakers near the controls and you use it while the device is closed, then that would block the speakers, so then you gotta put the speakers at the bottom, but instead we got the Wi-Fi antenna down there, and oh brother, I'm not an engineer, but there's gotta be a better way of doing this whole audio thing, right? But either way, audio is clearly an afterthought for this entire device. There's no headphone jack anywhere. The one speaker is firing away from your ears, and it's also tuned to be pretty loud, so even minimum volume might be louder than you're expecting. Now, if you want to use the USB-C port for headphones, then I wish you luck, because Anbernic doesn't include a USB-C dongle, so you're left to find your own that's compatible with the Rotate. And this device is quite picky with its dongles, and I found that out the hard way in front of dozens of people on stream. Let's try dongling on this dongle. Some dongles just aren't dongling right. I don't think they included a dongle either. That's a crazy move. So the first 3.5mm adapter I tried just flat out didn't work, and so did the second one until going into the settings, enabling developer mode, and switching the default USB configuration to MIDI. And then only one of the two dongles worked. Yo! Let's go! So there are certainly headphone dongles that'll work with the Rotate, but there are others that will just not work no matter what setting you're on. As much as people, showcase this as being an excellent MP3 player, little pocket-sized device, the fact that they don't include a dongle out of the box and leave you to find your own or try USB-C headphones that may or may not work I just can't recommend this as an audio player until Anbernic includes a dongle or fixes their software. And to be honest, I have nothing against people who are excited to showcase this as an audio player. Unfortunately, we're combining half-baked hardware and software with a passionate community. So the out-of-the-box people who aren't aware of that passionate community, they might not have a great experience on here. Even as a tinkerer, I couldn't get 2 of my earbud dongles to work. Anbernic publicly embarrassed me in front of dozens of live viewers. They basically pantsed me and gave me a swirly on stream.
Yeah, that's tight. Killing me, Anbernic.
Now, I've had a lot of technical gripes with the Rotate, but I want to talk about the overall quality. The quality of this handheld is surprisingly excellent. Honestly, it's a very premium feeling device for the price. The weight of the metal version feels solid without being too heavy or bulky. The consistent brushed metal texture is a great touch, and even the hinge feels sturdy and well designed. It doesn't feel like you're setting off a fucking rocket launcher like the RG Slide. But I've just really enjoyed the premium quality of this device. Anecdotally, it sounds like the plastic one is a bit cheaper feeling and more toy-like. I'm assuming it's similar to the RGDS with this soft plastic finish. They both have the same metal display plate and the same hinge, but I'd imagine that the plastic one would probably be more susceptible to damage over time. All right, we covered a lot in this review, pretty much every aspect of the hardware and software. So here's a simple list of pros, mids, and cons, where the mids could swing either way depending on your preferences. For pros, the top of the list would be its size. It's a very small but mighty-ish device. It's also a very versatile handheld that you can play when it's closed for touchscreen games, or you could play RPGs one-handed, and the square display gives us more vertical room for DS and 3DS games. And on top of that, the performance is very solid. We can run a lot of 3D consoles, even though we don't have analog input. I've also been very impressed with the software experience, especially out of the box. It automatically rotates the screen, everything works pretty well. We also have that front end button built right into the device, so we can just toggle between our front ends and the default Android home screen. The metal version of the Rotate also feels very premium. And of course, the Rotate rotates. The main feature of the device is the spinning screen. It's very refreshing to see something so fun and weird on a little handheld like this. It's like a modern version of the old rotating phones from the 2000s. Moving over to mids, I think that the first one would be its rotating screen. It's a kind of a quirky device. It's powerful, but we don't have analog sticks. And overall, it's just a weird handheld that doesn't exactly speak to everybody. And we have the square aspect ratio screen that isn't perfect for anything necessarily. It's kind of a jack of all, master of one, and the one being peak 08. And the display is always exposed, but you can use it as a little MP3 player or play touchscreen games because that screen is on the outside. So there is a benefit to an exposed screen. Now let's move over to the cons. The biggest con for me with the Rotate has been the audio experience. The backfiring speaker is a constant pebble in my shoe, and if you want to use headphones, you can either choose Bluetooth delay or USB-C earbuds. And customers are left out to dry because we don't even get a USB-C dongle with the device. The next major con would be the heat. This device gets hot with pretty much any slightly demanding game, and some people are more sensitive to heat than others. Next con is D-pad, more like D-bad, because this D-pad is pretty dog shit. The general inconsistency and accidental diagonals are a pretty major problem with this D-pad, so precision platformers and fighting games might be a bit problematic. Now the final con is the hardware bottlenecks. Anbernic gave us a very competent processor, but skimped pretty hard on the RAM and storage. We only have 3 gigs of RAM and a measly 32 gigs of internal storage. On an Android device, these are practically bare minimum, especially when their pre-installed apps already take up 1/3 of the storage. So the remaining 22 gigs of internal storage will quickly get eaten up, and in my experience from the RAM side of things, there's usually only about 1 gig of RAM available. So you're kind of on a shoestring budget when it comes to running Android with these specs. Now let's talk value. At the time of recording this, the RG Rotate starts at $88 US before shipping, while the metal version costs $20 more. These are the prices on Anbernic's website, but I would actually recommend buying from their AliExpress store and using whatever coupons the website gives you. From my experience, you can save around $10 to $20. But for the sake of this review, we're just going to refer to the price on Anbernic's website. At $108, I would consider this a well-rounded enthusiast device that's a bit outside of an entry-level price tier. While the hardware of the metal version feels incredibly premium, there's a lot of quirks that permeate throughout the overall experience. And if you're new to handhelds like this, these quirks might deter you from really enjoying the device, especially paying over $100 for it. Now, the Rotate is a very flashy handheld on paper, but I can't say that it's worth up to $108 before shipping for most people, considering there are simpler, less gimmicky devices that might be a better fit. However, if you're like me and don't mind a gimmick or two, maybe you're even interested in these gimmicks, then let me tell you, the Rotate is extremely charming and genuinely a unique experience. This just feels like an exciting device for me, and that's a hard thing to justify when it comes to its price. But the combination of games that I've been playing on here is both bizarre and really fun. I'm playing Animal Crossing New Leaf and Nubby's Number Factory on the same handheld in 2 form factors. I don't know what other device I'd be doing that on. Now, if you're deciding between the plastic and the metal version, I can't personally say which one to choose because I don't own the plastic one. But the metal version feels like it's worth the $20 premium, given the benefits of longevity and heat. I've also found that I personally gravitate towards metal devices, like the RG Nano and TrimUI Brick Hammer. So if you don't mind a slightly heavier handheld, then I think the metal Rotate is worth the upgrade. All right, now it's time I yap about how much I've been enjoying this damn thing. I've been completely obsessed with the Rotate for the last 5 or 6 weeks. It's just really fun and unique. The tiny form factor combined with the power makes it a really awesome little device for playing a ton of retro systems. But my favorite part of the RG Rotate is it just feels like a portal into a vast catalog of different systems and games. Flipping it open kind of feels like unlocking the door to this new dimension. And there's a lot of potential with the different games we can run on here. Also, great toilet handheld. The Rotate is polarizing because it has equal parts features and flaws. It doesn't follow the rules of what you'd expect in a normal handheld, and it defies conventional reason in quite a few ways. So if you're looking for a handheld that feels unmistakably unique, and you can tolerate some of its quirks, then the RG Rotate could be an excellent pocket companion. So that's the Anbernic RG Rotate, a tiny powerhouse with a modern spin on a classic design. Are you looking to pick one up? And if so, what games would you play on it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to grab one, you can find an affiliate link in the description. It supports the channel at no extra cost to you. Either way, thank you so much for hanging out with me in this review. If you liked the video, then like the video and subscribe for more reviews, tutorials, and other random shit. I'm MontoTech, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Later! If you like this video, then YouTube thinks you'll like this one, and you can check out my most recent video down here. Either way, I'll see you over there.